Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very excited that we have such a large group of people who are here. This is kind of a fun day. It's at least in my mind, there's kind of two objectives today. One is to learn about and kind of push a little bit on these thesis topics that our four presenters have been working on all year. The second, frankly, at least in my mind, is a little bit celebratory, in that Helen, Parker, Avery, and Ellison have all been doing very hard work for the better part of a year at this point. And hopefully this is a lot of fun for them and for us to kind of hear a little bit more detail about what that work looks like. So kind of, even before we get started, I want to give them all kind of a pat on the back and congratulations on the hard work they've done. I wish we could do this in person. This is the sort of event that's very conducive to having a gathering. Obviously, things are a little bit different this year, but I don't want to lose sight of the kind of celebratory nature of what these four have accomplished. With that, I'm very much looking forward to hearing more details about their thesis. The sort of format that we're going to use today, each of the presenters will have about 8 minutes to kind of present their thesis, at least at a high level, and then we'll open up for 6 to 8 minutes is kind of what we've budgeted. If it's a little longer or a little shorter, I think that's okay, of questions. And that's where I'd really encourage, I'd like to hear questions from all of you. I think the way that we'll do that is if you just enter questions in the chat window, kind of as the presenters are going. Once we enter that Q&A period, I can kind of moderate the chat and pass those on. I think that's the way to do it, probably in the least distracting manner. So that'll be the plan. Any questions from any of the presenters, or are you all kind of comfortable and feel like you're ready to go? All right, well, with that, our first presenter is Parker Haydon, and Parker is going to tell us about cryptocurrencies, in particular the potential for adoption in developed and developing nations. So Parker, you have the floor, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
All right, thank you, Professor. Hi, I'm Parker Haydon, and today I'm going to be presenting on my thesis entitled Cryptocurrencies, Evaluating the Potential for Adoption in Developed and Developing Nations. So as a really brief overview about what are cryptocurrencies, there are a couple underlying factors that are common amongst most, if not all, cryptocurrencies. The first is that they are decentralized, so they have almost no central authority. They utilize blockchain as their underlying technology. They have distributed ledger technology, meaning that everyone in the network has a copy of all of the transactions that have occurred. They're permissionless, so everyone can interact with the public blockchain. And then finally, they are secured via cryptography. So with this in mind, the question that my thesis sought to address was, what is the potential for the widespread adoption of cryptocurrencies, and how does this potential change across developed and developing nations? To answer this question, I looked at 5 main factors that would influence the adoption of technology, specifically cryptocurrencies. And my first factor is the existing state, which looks at adoption and how that has already been occurring, and also current performance of fiat currencies. Next, I looked at store of value, which looks at the ability for cryptocurrencies to retain value in periods of hyperinflation and economic downturn. Third, I looked at the unbanked, which looks at the ability for cryptocurrencies to serve as a tool to promote financial inclusion. Fourth, I looked at perceptions and associations, which looked at people's ideas and thoughts about cryptocurrencies. And then finally, I looked at regulation, which looks at laws and regulation surrounding cryptocurrencies. So specifically, I focused on 3 countries for my research. I looked at the United States as my developed region. And for my developing nations, I looked at Venezuela and Argentina. So the first factor I looked at is the existing state. And this first looked at existing adoption. So from the graph you can see on the left, this shows the number of wallets that were downloaded. And wallet is a technical term where people can store their cryptocurrencies. And as you can see, this has increased dramatically in past years, which serves as a testament to adoption that has already been happening. And then also, if you look at exchanges that are specifically in the United States, Argentina, and Venezuela, you can tell that this level of adoption has been happening in all three of these countries at a growing rate as well. And then to look at fiat currency performance, as you can see on the right, this is the 2018 inflation data in all three of the countries I looked at. So in the United States, there has been very low inflation at about 2.4% per year. In Argentina, it's significantly higher at about 34%. And then Venezuela is in a period of hyperinflation, and their inflation is at about 65,000%. So in Argentina and Venezuela, their fiat currencies are losing value at a much faster rate than the US dollar is. And for this reason, there is a greater incentive for people to turn to cryptocurrencies in these regions. The second factor I looked at is the store of value. And as we just saw in the last slide, hyperinflation is a huge problem in Venezuela and has been a problem for Argentina in the past. And as the research has shown, cryptocurrencies are better able to store their value, especially during times of hyperinflation. And the other way to look at cryptocurrencies and their ability to store value is in periods of economic downturn. One example was the Cyprus banking crisis in 2012. So Cyprus was undergoing a huge period of economic downturn. And essentially what happened was there was a huge fee placed when people wanted to withdraw their money from banks. So because people didn't want to incur this fee, they started turning to cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin. And the number of Bitcoin wallets during this period exponentially grew. And as you can see from the graph on the right, the price of Bitcoin grew as well. So this instance showed that whereas the equity market in Cyprus was failing and their fiat currency was failing, Bitcoin was able to retain its value very well. The third factor I looked at is the unbanked, which looks at financial exclusion globally. There are millions of people worldwide that do not have access to bank accounts and financial services. And as you can see from the graph on the left, 65% of people in Latin America do not have access to these services. And some of the reasons listed when you interview people that are unbanked are that there are high transaction fees, long physical distances to banks, especially if you live in a rural area. There are lots of documentation requirements. And finally, there is centuries of a lack of distrust with large financial institutions, particularly for the unbanked population. And cryptocurrencies can actually overcome a lot of these issues because they have much lower transaction fees, no physical distance to banks. If you're using virtual wallets, you can access those anywhere. There is, for most cryptocurrencies, almost no documentation necessary, so you don't need a valid ID or anything like that. And then finally, it completely circumvents the issue of establishing trust with financial institutions because there's really no link to financial institutions and they're completely decentralized. The fourth factor I looked at is perceptions and associations. Like with any technology, how people feel about a technology really has a strong bearing on its adoption rates. And for cryptocurrencies, one of the strongest associations that people have is they associate it with illicit activity. And this is for pretty good reason. As you can see in 2013, it was estimated that between 40% and 80% of people that were using Bitcoin were using it to finance illicit activities. And as you can see from the graph, this figure is definitely declining. And as adoption continues, this rate will continue to decrease as more and more people are using cryptocurrencies for either investing or just general purposes and not illicit activities. So it is definitely believed that this association with illicit activities will subside over time as they become more mainstream. Also in Venezuela and Argentina, there are strict currency laws where individuals can't hold more stable currencies like the euro or the US dollar. And so people perceive cryptocurrencies as kind of a last-ditch effort at achieving any sort of financial stability. And as a result, they might be more willing to kind of overlook this affiliation with illicit activities as of now. The final factor I looked at is regulation. And as you can see, there are a whole host of regulatory issues ranging from accounting treatment, initial coin offerings, also known as ICOs, taxation, sales regulation, anti-money laundering requirements, and reporting requirements. All of these are very key areas of regulation, and they're all very involved. And when governments are approaching these issues, they have to utilize what's known as the regulatory paradox. And that's kind of where governments have to decide if they want to implement regulation, which will better protect investors from, fraudulent behavior and other illicit activities. But if they choose not to implement regulation, then this facilitates more innovation and more widespread adoption. And so in the United States, Argentina, and Venezuela, there's very little, if any, regulation of cryptocurrencies, which suggests that in the future, there will be continued innovation and continued adoption. So then in conclusion, my thesis looks at 5 main factors that would influence the adoption of cryptocurrencies: the existing state, store of value, the unbanked, thoughts and perceptions, and regulation. And these 5 factors all concluded that regulation will likely continue, or that adoption will continue to increase in the future, and that in Argentina and Venezuela, there is greater incentive to adopt cryptocurrencies than in the United States. And that concludes my presentation today. If anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a very good presentation. And obviously, cryptocurrencies are something that are of a great deal of interest and in the press very frequently. So hopefully we have some good questions as well. Let me just break the ice with one, and then I'll go ahead and kind of go to the chat. And I guess my question regards the regulation. It seems like there's, as you indicate, there's been a big push very recently to figure out, at least in the US, what's the right regulatory infrastructure. I guess you could see some of those regulations being harmful to innovation and development, and that seems to be part of your thesis. You could also see that part of those regulations may garner more trust and kind of lead to greater acceptance of cryptocurrencies. So I guess if you think about the US regulatory environment, are there examples of regulations that you think are going to be harmful to the development of cryptocurrencies versus things that you think are more likely to foster that sort of trust?
Yeah, so worldwide, there have been a lot of studies that have tracked markets' responses to regulation in various countries. And the research has kind of concluded that markets like a light touch in terms of regulation. So they like regulation that isn't going to majorly affect the way that people are trading and using cryptocurrencies, but they do like to see a little bit of regulation because it kind of ensures that governments don't have any plans to shut down the future of cryptocurrencies or anything like that. So I guess to answer your question, I think the areas that people are definitely starting to regulate more so are like kind of anti-money laundering practices, things that are clearly illegal, but are using cryptocurrencies to kind of facilitate these measures. And so definitely the United States is looking at ways to kind of introduce legislation that doesn't just completely shut down innovation, but definitely kind of tries to mitigate some of these issues that are going on right now.
And are you generally optimistic or pessimistic that the U.S. is kind of on a path to striking a good balance there?
I think as of now, they've done a pretty good job. I mean, the FBI, a lot of my research looked at the Silk Road, which is kind of a dark website that was pretty notorious for using Bitcoin. And the FBI was like developing a lot of great techniques for being able to identify people that were utilizing the Silk Road for illicit purposes. No one was really using it for a moral purpose, but being able to actually track down these people. And so I think the US is definitely on a good path so far.
Okay, well, let me go to the chat, and I think we have time for a couple of things. Some of these are kind of clarifying questions, so maybe fairly quick. One is, in your research, do you focus on a particular cryptocurrency, or are you really looking at cryptocurrencies generally? And maybe to make that a little more pointed, do you have any predictions for particular cryptocurrencies that you think are conducive to these developing countries?
Yeah, so far, almost all of the research out there is aimed at Bitcoin just because it has the largest market capitalization and largest user base. And so that's pretty much the dominant research out there. I tried to look for my thesis. I don't necessarily know that Bitcoin is the end all be all. And so for future adoption, I definitely tried to take more of a general stance about cryptocurrencies and their general like characteristics and traits that could lend themselves to solving issues like, for example, the unbanked. But in terms of past performance, like how it's been able to act as a store of value, then I definitely had to look more so at Bitcoin for those questions.
Great. And what drew you to focus on the U.S., Argentina, and Venezuela? I guess I can imagine the U.S. is natural, but Argentina and Venezuela as your sort of laboratories for more developing countries.
Yeah, definitely. So the US, kind of like you were saying, is always spearheading innovation, and it's definitely a hot spot for initial coin offerings. And so that was one of the reasons I focused on the US. And then for Argentina and Venezuela, specifically for remittances, Latin America is one of the highest remittance, actually, I think it is the highest remittance receiving region in the world. And both of those nations have been characterized by high inflation, and that is a problem that cryptocurrencies can solve. And then finally, Venezuela is really interesting because the government themselves launched their own cryptocurrency known as the Petro. And so that was definitely an interesting case study to look at as well, seeing a government-sponsored cryptocurrency.
Excellent. Well, let me just conclude with one more question, and then there are a couple other things in chat that that we could come back to later if there's time. But just I think a good way to wrap this up is one of the questions was just of the 5 factors that you highlighted, what do you think is the most important or most influential?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question, but I would probably say regulation, just because when you look at different countries worldwide, for example, China banned all cryptocurrency exchange platforms, and so that has significantly stifled adoption. And I also think that when regulation is introduced, it can definitely taint people's thoughts and perceptions about cryptocurrencies. And so in that way, people kind of, when they see regulation, might start to think, I mean, for example, in China, there's definitely more underground cryptocurrency things happening. Cryptocurrencies aren't really going anywhere. So that can definitely lead to people more associating cryptocurrencies with illicit activities once again.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. This is a fascinating thesis topic, and I wish we could spend the next hour talking to you. But obviously, we need to make sure we split up our time amongst all of the very interesting topics here. So why don't we move on in the interest of time to Avery. So Avery Leake is going to talk to us about national technology policy diffusion through central bank and digital currencies. So we have a little bit of a touch point between these 2 thesis topics. So with that, Avery, you have the floor. Please go ahead and get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor Kruger. My name is Avery Leake. I am a double major in Plan II mathematics here at UT. And as Professor Kruger referred to, I'm doing my thesis on national technology policy diffusion through central bank digital currencies, which is a lot of words basically to say I'm looking at how governments are behaving. So to start off, I'm going to start us with a story. This story takes us all the way to Estonia. And basically, one of my favorite things about Estonia, I've actually never been, but I'm hoping to go soon, is that it is a global leader in digital governance. And so Estonia has done a lot of really cool things with digital voting and digital identity. Back in 2017, they really wanted to extend this. So they decided to present their own cryptocurrency. And I'm really happy that Parker went before me so she could explain to you what a cryptocurrency was, because I'll be talking a lot about those in my presentation. But Estonia decided that they were going to release their own called Estcoin. And everyone thought this was a really cool idea in Estonia. Everyone thought outside of it, or at least in the cryptocurrency field, that this would be super cool. Everyone except for the European Union. And so I don't know if many of you know, but Estonia is part of the EU, which means that they use the euro. Unfortunately, monetary unions like the European Union don't really take kindly to you putting forward another currency. And so as all tragedies end, we saw the Estcoin kind of fire up in a blaze of glory, where Estonia retracted their statements. Mario Draghi, the president of the ECB at the time, criticized the cryptocurrency, and Estcoin was no longer. However, this did lead into a much larger field of central bank digital currencies. And so I want to start by defining central bank digital currencies, basically using a big variety of what scholars in the field are currently deeming currencies and deeming central bank currencies. So first, it has to be digitally native. Parker talked a little bit about this, but These are currencies that are entirely online. It's not anything that's paper. You're not just recording it on an Excel spreadsheet on your computer somewhere, but they're paper dollars. These are entirely digitally based. Second, they're going to be anchored by a central bank. It has to be some centralized institution or government that is the driving force and the basis of trust for this money. Money is debt inherently, and that central bank is going to guarantee that debt. Third, it has to have a user base that is nationally relevant. I'm going to talk a little bit more about issuers and users later on, but we want to make sure the users within the nation are actually paying with this currency. So here is the current landscape using a really cool tool that was released a couple months ago by CBDC Tracker. And this shows the landscape of all central bank digital currencies that are being researched or released so far. You'll see a couple of pockets of purple. That means they've been released, the biggest one being in China, the DCP. I'm not going to talk about it today, but I think that we're going to hear a little bit more about it. But there are a really wide variety of nations that have adopted CBDCs so far. And this is a pretty impressive spread of countries that are really researching this. Now, there are a couple of axes that I think I need to talk about if I'm going to talk about central bank digital currencies. The first being blockchain versus distributed ledger technology. So Parker talked a little bit about this, which was great. And she talked about the distributed network. The centralized network, however, uses almost the exact same technology. And so my favorite part about talking to people about blockchain is that I get to tell them this is super cool. I love it. At the end of the day, it's an accounting metric. It is basically a stepped up version of the double ledger accounting that everyone did. And so the distributed network sends that entire ledger over to everybody. And that's what Parker mentioned was permissionless. Anybody can have access to the blockchain. A centralized network uses proof of authority instead. It has a central network, maybe the central bank, who gets to authorize different banks or merchants that they can verify transactions. One of the big discussions in central bank digital currencies today is whether or not to use DLT, distributed ledger technology, because it is really effective for some things, but not so effective for others. And I'll talk about that as well. The other axis I really want to talk about is the issuers and users and the spread between retail and wholesale. So in any currency, you're going to have an issuer, which is usually the central bank. That's that little flag at the top you see. And you're going to have the users. And so for most currencies, paper currencies, this doesn't come into question. The users are always going to be everybody in a nation or everybody who's participating in exchanging this currency. However, with central bank digital currencies, we've seen a big split. First, into whether the people are going to be using it. Is it a consumer to business payments or a peer-to-peer transactional currency? And that's called a retail CBDC. Or is it just going to be the banks and financial institutions? Is it Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan getting to pay each other with this central bank digital currency? And that's called a wholesale digital currency. One of the big reasons we're seeing this split is because distributed ledger technology is not incredibly efficient for smaller transactions. And so a lot of nations with really developed financial sectors have sat there and said, hey, we like this distributed ledger technology. We don't particularly want to use it for peer-to-peer transactions or business to consumer transactions. We're just going to use it as a wholesale CBDC for bank-to-bank payments. So we've seen this breakdown between retail and wholesale, and they break it down on the tracker as well as I did in my data. So moving on, what I did for this project was I surveyed all of the countries in the world and basically developed a few different variables. First, do they have a central bank digital currency? And I used that kind of rigorous three-part definition that I said earlier and said, hey, zeros and ones, do you have it? And I cut it off, funny enough, at February 2020, because that was about the time that the world changed. And so we see a pretty big framing and a big exogenous shock to this trend as COVID came in, but it was a nice cutoff date. So that means countries like the US, who just recently released a proposal, got a zero. And that's fine. It shows that they're not quite at this central bank digital currency place. The other variables I collected were the DLT or not DLT and retail and wholesale. And then what I'm hoping to do in my preliminary results is compare it against all these World Bank and IMF statistics to find out what explains this government behavior. And so initially what I've seen is I've seen three main trends in our preliminary results. And I want you to kind of think back to Estonia and the EU when we look through these. So first, countries are seeking an edge in their geopolitical maneuvering. Some countries are bigger and take leadership roles, and this is really why you've seen China take a big interest in central bank digital currencies. They want to be an economic superpower. And the US is currently the economic superpower in the world and has the major reserve currency. A Chinese central bank digital currency that takes off is going to give them a huge geopolitical edge. That's a huge driving factor for China and for other nations to adopt a CBDC. On the flip side, you see Estonia as a smaller nation. They really want to be a leader in technology and innovation. So they're also going to try to seek this geopolitical edge. Second, we look at the incumbent industries. And so in a lot of developed nations, we have a really robust financial system. This is Hong Kong, this is the United States, this is the UK, this is the European Union. These countries have really, really large banks that participate all over the world. In a lot of these countries, we're seeing that they're either not pursuing a central bank digital currency or they're pursuing a wholesale digital CBDC rather than a retail one. They don't particularly care that there aren't that many people participating in the system right now. And that's okay. That's what their priorities right now. On the flip side, we're seeing a lot of countries with an emerging technology industry really take a different approach to this. So the Caribbean has been a hotbed for these CBDCs. We've seen the Bahamas release the sand dollar. We've seen the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, which is a nation of island or a group of island nations, release Dcash. And so all of these, they believe that technology rather than financial industry is the future. And they're really working with the technology companies in the Caribbean to develop these CBDCs. Finally,
Avery, let me just jump in with a time check that we probably should wrap it up here in another couple of minutes.
Yep. Awesome. Finally, and then this is one that Parker really talked about, is financial inclusion. A lot of nations have a problem with their unbanked and underbanked individuals, and we've seen CBDCs as a bit of a salve to this. And so mobile technology has really taken off, and countries, governments are sitting there saying, hey, you know, we can have people participate in the financial system without necessarily having to hold cash or understand what a checking account is. They can do it through their phone. So this has been a big driving force and the reason that countries have adopted a CBDC. So these are the three main trends I've seen in preliminary results, and hopefully as I continue to develop the research, it will prove that these are true as well. And that's all I have. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Avery. So let me kind of follow the trend from last time. I'll break the ice with a question, and then we'll go to chat. Why don't I start with a big picture question? How do you see the central bank digital currencies in relation to non-central bank digital currencies? I mean, do you see as more and more central banks introduce these, are they going to displace the role for something like Bitcoin, or do you see them as substitutes, or do you see them as complements?
Yeah, so I struggled with this a little bit because I think my personal views diverge a little bit from my academic views. Academically, I think what we've seen is a lot of governments are behaving in a reactionary way towards Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. They really don't like that cryptocurrencies are coming up and trying to take away the power that currency issuing is. I think they were a little bit late. And so if I were to express kind of my guesses, I really think that Bitcoin is here to stay. And I think Ethereum as well. I don't know if we're going to see a huge rise in cryptocurrencies across the board, but I think those have established that they have a niche and they have a desire, and especially in countries like Parker was pointing out, where the citizens don't really trust the native currency. They're a really nice asset class that people can use and trade and rely upon for a much more consistent store of value. However, I think central bank digital currencies are going to be a big part of the future. I don't think that Bitcoin is going to take over the world and be the global reserve currency, mostly because central bank digital currencies have a huge advantage of being the incumbent. Countries still have a lot of power, and that this monetary issuance and issuing that money is a significant power that governments still control. And you see it in the way that they're regulating cryptocurrencies, and you see it in the way that they're trying to compete with cryptocurrencies. I think you're on mute. Professor, I think we still can't hear you, or I still can't hear you at least.
I'm sorry. So a question from the chat. Could you expand a bit on the geopolitical edge? So how do these central bank digital currencies give countries a geopolitical edge?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We're seeing this in a couple of different ways. So you're seeing it in the kind of leadership paradigm. As we talked about, we have the leaders competing for reserve currency status. So that's China, the United States, even Russia to some degree. And they're all rushing to try and make sure that their currency is used by a lot more countries. And so right now we're seeing that the US dollar is used by just about all over the world for financial transactions. And this is a big institution of power for the United States. They can issue debt in this way. And so it's a really large control mechanism. China and Russia and other main superpowers really want to undermine this. They'd like to become the reserve currency, and China's been doing a lot of reserve currency swaps to this effect. And so that's a big geopolitical lever where if they can get a jump on the new technology that is being implemented in money around the world, and if countries eventually kind of wake up and say, shoot, we're no longer doing paper currency anymore, we're doing this CBDC digitally native aspect of it, China could have that edge. On the flip side of that, you see the emerging countries as kind of another geopolitical player. And so you see the Caribbean nations, you see the Estonias of the world, these smaller nations really trying to gain a technological advantage so that they can give their people an advantage and possibly can increase the value of their currency compared to the rest of the world, which would enrich their country. And that would be a big geopolitical lever.
So let me just wrap up with one more question, and you can answer this one of two ways. It's either a should or a will, and that's kind of your sort of forecast for what's going to happen in the U.S. in terms of what sort of CBDC you think the Fed will introduce. Will it be more targeted at retail or wholesale? And I guess I'm curious both in what you think will happen, but also what you think should happen. And I guess you can choose which you're more interested in focusing on or more comfortable focusing on.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the US is an interesting case. I was talking with a friend the other day, basically saying a lot of these developed nations probably are doing this research. They're not publishing it nearly to the same degree as developing nations are, or as nations that are trying to gain a foothold in this field are. But you see the EU has a project. I'm going to guess that the Federal Reserve banks have been researching CBDCs to some degree. In my personal opinion, I really don't think it's to the correct degree. I think they should be focusing a lot more on it. And as you said, you broke it down really nicely. There's the should and the will. And I think the US has a really, really strong incumbent financial industry, and it's really, really powerful in the lobby. And so I think if we do see a CBDC anytime soon, it's going to be wholesale. I think it's going to be these bank-to-bank transactions. I think it's going to mostly replace the Federal Reserve ledgers that we already see. A big potential shock to that was COVID, and I'll talk about that in a second. But for me, I'm a big believer in the retail aspect of CBDC. I think that it's such a big boon for financial inclusion and participation in financial systems, which is just a big manifestation of power. Being able to open a checking account and have debt and have these mechanisms is so powerful for individuals that I think if we are able to put in place the retail CBDC, we should. And specifically, we saw what this can do, where if the government can give people direct payments in an easy, safe, and accountable fashion, like we needed to for stimulus during COVID, this can be such a powerful instrument both for the government and for the people. And that is something that the private industry is a little bit adversarial towards. And so I think you get to see that interplay between these three actors in the system.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Avery. So with that, why don't we shift to Ellison? And Ellison is also going to present on a topic related to digital currencies. The title of her thesis is Game of Coins, Central Bank Digital Currencies, and the Future of the International Monetary System. So with that, Ellison, you have the floor, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much. I did change my title a bit, but it's a similar topic. I decided to focus exclusively on the digital yuan. So hopefully there's been a lot of questions about it. So hopefully it's still interesting after Avery's present a little bit of commentary on it. So You've probably seen a lot of headlines. I think our presentation looks a bit like, or our sequence of presentations today look a bit like a Wall Street Journal newspaper front page. We're definitely hitting some important topics. But these were some of the things I was seeing that made me interested and realize that there's a lot more at stake than just, oh, how am I going to pay for my Starbucks coffee? Like Avery mentioned, the reserve asset comes with a lot of power, and that's how I oriented my question. So I really, with my thesis, wanted to answer 3 questions: the strategic origins of the digital yuan, their intent, and its implications for the US. So starting with the origins of dissent, I took a network theory approach, which essentially is mapping the connectivity of any node in the global economic system and the power of the degrees that node has. So nodes that have higher degrees tend to be very centralized, and you can leverage that, as we'll see in 2 cases. I'm going to cover the case of the financial messaging system and the case of the internet. So in the case of global finance, not only is the dollar the reserve asset, but it's also used in transactions, especially foreign transactions. So it denominates 80% of international trade and 87% of foreign exchange transactions. This is important because dollars are actually illegal to be held outside of the US, except for in cash. And we have a lot of cash outside the US, but that means deposits aren't able to be held in offshore accounts. Therefore, any foreign transaction requires a correspondent bank in the US. So there's really important implications after 2001. When we started the war on terror. This started allowing some of the agencies more privileges into the financial messaging system. Financial messaging system SWIFT typically sees the global volumes of about 70 to 80% of all transactions, and it's required to do any with the dollar. So in 2012, the EU actually withdrew their sanctions on non-standard charter on Iran, and the US kept theirs. That made it illegal to use US dollars to fund any of the banks, local individuals in Iran. Standard Charter did conduct some transactions, and it was only once it came onto US soil that it became illegal. It broke US law. So why is this relevant? We have a UK bank that has not broken a UK law or a UN sanction that is now being fined $350 million for a different country's laws. So we call this the extraterritorial jurisdiction, and the EU starts to have problems with this. The next case I want to talk about is that of Russia. So increased resistance to US hegemony over the financial system. This one's interesting because the US actually didn't impose sanctions. They didn't cut off Russia from SWIFT as they did Iran. Instead, they threatened the possibility of it. And there was a really important quote that came from this that said, if they are cut off from SWIFT, our economic reaction, generally any other reaction, will be without limits. They called this the nuclear threshold equivalent in the financial system. And it really levied the stakes and led directly to the segue of China's reaction. Around this time, China started developing their own version of SWIFT, which would not use dollars, but would enable cross-border transactions completely out of the oversight of US powers. And this was escalated in response to Huawei's bans. They specifically noted that SWIFT is gradually becoming a financial instrument for the US, for the United States to exercise global hegemony and exercise long-arm jurisdiction. So this was in 2016, and about 2 years prior, that was when China officially started launching their digital yuan research. And so we start to see these timelines really escalating the more the US exercises on their power. Now, the second case I want to talk about is the case of communication networks. Obviously, with globalization, we've become a lot more connected, and that can often exchange really good things. But if the last year and a half is any indicator, also bad things can cross borders. And specifically for countries, information crossing borders has been a concern. despite the distributed aspect and the openness and connectedness, kind of these liberal, democracy-oriented qualities that the internet's given, or at least given in rhetoric, it's not that way in the infrastructure. So 70% is actually of global network traffic goes through one hub, one Amazon hub in Northern Virginia. 97% goes through 300 cables. These are maritime cables across the Atlantic, and 59% of the world population has Facebook accounts. So we see a lot of data concentrated in both infrastructure hubs and systematic hubs. Again, 2001 was an important year for how the US changed how they exploited this power. It's a lot of companies on US soil, which makes them subject to US laws. And so with the passing of the PRISM Act, Patriot Act, and the actually revoked Stellar Winds Act, we see that the governments start to have a lot more cooperation and voluntary agreements with some of these companies, in which metadata is handed over on call logs. So you might think, oh, how much information can a government get from having your call history? Well, actually, if you have called a particular philanthropic org or a political org, they now can gauge what your politics might be, who you're potentially donating to. And so you can see how that has potential citizen risk and then very clearly foreign risk as well. So I call this the Janus face of decentralized technology. There's often a lot of hype about the distributed nature of these technologies, yet in reality—
Let me just interject with a time check. We should probably wrap up in another kind of minute or two.
Okay. I'll speed through. So China's strategic intent. I wanted to ask some questions. So you hear currency, Cold War, and a few other pretty inflammatory rhetoric. And I wanted to ask 3 questions. Are these founded? Can we even gauge intent? And if we can gauge China's intent, what does it say about ours, especially looking at these historical precedents? There's a few ways to measure this. One of them has been design choices. The problem with this is that there's not much publicly known about these, about the DCEP. There's a lot of speculation. And this can lead to perceived strategic intent, and specifically perceived strategic intent that emphasizes a few qualities that you see in red above others. And so I wanted to take a more empirical approach. Obviously, there's been a navel gazing, and look at the 3 shortcomings, and specifically one I'll highlight today is how a narrow traditional framework can potentially leave out a lot of information about DCEP's strategy that we're not quite considering. Avery actually hinted at this. It's the goal to become a global economic power, and they've made quite a bit of progress to that in the past few years. So importantly, these have all of the characteristics that aren't bolded that have been described in traditional monetary frameworks. The 2 I want to highlight is that China's is interoperable with other chains. So unlike Bitcoin, where it can only act, if you want an on-chain transaction, it's only limited to the Bitcoin chain. Their currency can operate across change and still provide the same amount of control and oversight to the PRC. Secondly, it's programmable. This is completely different from, per se, let's say Bitcoin. These allow for atomic swaps, which are important with how currency exchange is going to be exchanged. It happens instantaneously and very cheaply compared to how currently cross-border payments work. And it also allows for a lot more DeFi to be built on top. So this fundamentally changes the nature of sovereign money from that of dollars that are transacted to dollars that can have entire digital finance built around them. And that's currently not something we're seeing in the US. Also importantly, there's an ecosystem built around the strategy that is beyond just the DCEP. There's been a lot of global developments to build smart cities and smart ports that allow for data to be collected by sensors and sent to this blockchain network. This blockchain-based service network also allows for some of the most popular and emerging blockchains to be accessible to the China public in a way that is permissioned. So even permissionless chains become permissioned, Applications can be built outside of China and still go beyond the Great Firewall. And most importantly, the digital yuan becomes the river that runs through this architecture. It's the medium in which they can engage, because unlike Ethereum, where you would pay in Ether, their permissioned chains require you to pay in digital yuan. This fundamentally changes the questions about strategic intent. My thesis is that there's two phases in which the strategic intent rolls out. One is by customer acquisition, in which China's competing not by coercion, as a lot of Western rhetoric might imply, but actually by co-option. It's enticing. It is acting like Alipay and Amazon, not like an authoritarian country. And so that's really important for how we think about how the US might frame a strategy. So by attracting them to the platform, that then generates much more data that can be used to extract insights, both for economic initiatives, to establish standards of interoperability, similar to the ones that the US established in the 70s, and overall, harness more network power that we saw was so important at the beginning of the presentation. This last page is where is the implications. I know I'm probably a little short on time, but I think this, where I'm at in my research is understanding how to shape a conversation about not just how the US government could react, but also how individuals should react. Obviously, there's a lot of stake with privacy and future economic growth at play. And so these are a few of the questions. I can leave them up to ponder, and I'm happy to answer any others. But thanks so much for letting me share some of my research.
That's really great, Ellison. Thank you very much. Let me again break the ice with a question. How successful do you predict the digital yuan is going to be? I mean, do you think China is on a path to displace the dollar's kind of role as the reserve currency?
The first part of your question is easier to answer than the second. I think that China has designed a currency that fixes a problem. And that there's a lot of rural Chinese citizens that don't have access to even a feature phone. And something that is very innovative about China's digital yuan is that they allow for offline digital payments. So if you have, it uses near field technology. So even if you're not connected to the internet, not connected to 5G, you can still interact with your family, another person, a storefront, and exchange that way. So it's very inclusive. And in my opinion, that automatically fosters economic growth. The more people you can get engaged in the economy, that seems pretty positive. So I think in terms of domestic takeoff, their strategy of again, co-option and not coercion seems to be pretty positive. In terms of the displacing the reserve asset, I think the more they attract foreign companies to trying to access a 1.4 billion person market, the more they can demand that payments start to be made in the renminbi or digital yuan, as opposed to dollars, which are currently denominating asset. And that seems to be a reasonable stepping stone to perhaps, if not becoming the world reserve, at least gaining more share. But I wouldn't speculate about timelines for where it could get there.
And what do you think the U.S. can learn from what China has already accomplished? Are there lessons that we should take as the U.S. kind of pursues its own CBDCs?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One I've been thinking about a lot. I think something that's interesting about China's approach is that it's been very collaborative between the government and private sector, which lines are a little blurred there, but the number of tech giants that are part of both the BSN and the core DCEP project is very impressive. And it contrasts so strongly US's approach or response to Libra. Not saying I was exactly enthusiastic about Facebook potentially making money, or doing, which I think someone called them Zuckbucks. I think that would have been a better name, but I think that there's a lot to learn there, and the ability to harness some very advanced technology. China has invested heavily into AI and how they're using that to actually promote economic growth and more distributed economic growth, I think is something that many US citizens are probably interested in, as opposed to the current headlines about declining jobs and unemployment. So I would love to see more collaboration between the private and public sector, like the US used to do in the past.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Ellison. And with that, why don't we shift gears to Helen? I think we're doing pretty reasonably on time, and we may even have a few minutes left at the end if there's kind of some general Q&A for everyone. But I want to make sure that we have enough time for Helen as well. So with that, Helen is going to talk to us about gambling with American futures. How does the United States student loan industry hurt the people it was designed to help? The floor is yours, Helen.
Thank you, Professor Kruger. So my name is Helen, and I'm a senior finance and Plan II major. And today I'll be talking with you all about my thesis, which is titled Gambling with American Futures. How does the United States student loan industry hurt the people it was designed to help? And before we get into my presentation, I'd like you all to meet Jack Connolly. Jack's a 60-year-old high school English teacher living in Cole Township, Pennsylvania. He's a single father and he makes $30,000 a year. In his lifetime, he's received a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. And currently, Jack Connolly has $233,921 in student debt. And while it's true that Jack is only one of the 44 million Americans with student loan debt today, and his situation might be rather rare, it's important because it highlights the severity of this crisis. Jack is certainly not the only one who's being hurt by a system that was designed to help him. So my presentation today will be twofold. First, I'll explain the student loan industry and provide an overview of where student debt stands today and why it's considered a crisis. And second, I'll explore a few of the many concerns that I have regarding the ethics of the system. So in our society today, it's widely thought that a person needs a college degree to be successful. So people are often willing to do whatever it takes to get that degree so that they can get a good job and live a good life. But when it comes to paying for that college degree, many people can't afford to do it on their own. For the 2017 and 2018 academic year, 86% of all incoming students at colleges received some form of financial aid to help pay for the cost. And often they'll take out student loans. And when a person takes out a student loan, they're borrowing from their future selves. Their present self gets the money, but it's their future self who's the one paying it back. And so essentially, when a person takes out a student loan, they're making a gamble. Their present self is taking on debt to finance their higher education with the hope that it'll get them a degree and a well-paying job, a job that'll allow them to easily pay back that debt. But a lot of the time, they make that gamble and things don't work out the way they planned. So now we'll take a very quick look at the origins and structure of the student loan industry. The industry as we know it today began with the signing of the 1965 Higher Education Act. And the goal of this act was to make college more accessible and affordable to Americans by establishing the Guaranteed Student Loan Program, which is the precursor to today's federal student loan programs. And from there, the government continued to expand its loan programs. And today there are 4 categories of loans available through the government. But the government's not the only lender. Students also have the option to take out a loan made by a private lender. For example, a corporation such as Sallie Mae or a bank like Bank of America. And while federal loans have specific terms that really don't change borrower to borrower, private loan terms can be drastically different depending on the specific lender and the specific situation of the borrower, making it a rather complicated space. And although both options are available, students more often borrow from the federal government, with around 86% of loans being made by the federal government and only 14% being made by private lenders. So now let's take a look at where student debt stands today. Currently, there are 44.7 million borrowers who together owe over $1.71 trillion in student loan debt. And this graph shows how outstanding student loan debt has grown from 2010 to 2020. So over that decade, it grew by 99.6%. So quite literally almost doubling entirely. And here we can see how the 44.7 million borrowers are broken up between those who borrowed as undergraduates and those who borrowed as graduates. In 2019, the number of graduate loans made up 16% of all federal student loans issued. But while there were a small number of the loans issued, they actually accounted for 41% of all federal loan dollars dispersed. So even though graduate students account for fewer borrowers, they're a very important catalyst for the growth in outstanding debt. And next, we're going to look at 3 reasons that outstanding student debt is increasing at such an alarming rate. The first reason is that the cost of college is rising. In the last 20 years, average published tuition and fees at colleges in these 3 sectors has all more than doubled. And over the same period, however, mean family incomes have only grown 39%. So American families are struggling to keep up with these rising tuition costs, and it's becoming harder and harder to afford college. And the second reason is that more students are going to college. Between 2000 and 2018, national undergraduate enrollment grew 26% and national graduate enrollment grew 41%. And it's a well-known fact that graduate programs are often much more expensive than undergraduate programs. So with more people taking out loans to pursue graduate degrees, the overall amount being borrowed is skyrocketing, which leads into the last reason, which is that borrowers are taking out increasingly large loans. From 2013 to 2020, the average loan amount held by a borrower grew by over $10,000, which is an increase of almost 47% in just 7 years. So just thinking about how much student debt has grown makes it clear that it's a crisis. But beyond these quantitative reasons that student debt is troubling, there are a lot of qualitative reasons that make it even more concerning. So the final part of my presentation is going to focus on some of the implications and ethical concerns surrounding the student loan industry. A recent study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology analyzed the different ways that different forms of debt affect people. And the study found that student loan debt is perceived as far more psychologically burdensome than any other form of debt. It's the mental stress and emotional burden that student debt carries that's causing borrowers to increasingly put off buying a home and starting a family, which are things that they might have included in the dream life that they pictured when they took out the loans to go to college in the first place. And not only is the mental health and personal well-being of borrowers being affected, but their financial health is being damaged too. For example, if a borrower defaults on their loan payments, their credit can be ruined, which often labels them as unhireable, making it even harder for them to try and get a well-paying job to pay off their loans. And these examples are only a few of the ways that student debt and the way that the industry is designed are really hurting American borrowers for years and even decades after they leave college. And now I'm going to be explaining a few aspects of the student loan system that make it so harmful and raise quite a few ethical flags. I've talked about how borrowers are being financially burdened by their debt, but the federal government is actually profiting off of their debt. Back in 2013, they made $50 billion in profit off of student loans, while those borrowers were often struggling to make ends meet. And additionally, I mentioned a corporation, Sallie Mae, earlier. Sallie Mae was created as a government-sponsored corporation back in 1972, with the good intentions of creating a secondary market for student loans to ensure the future availability of credit. But today it's a private corporation, and it's one that's also making a large profit off of student loans. In a leaked memo, Sallie Mae officials said that their second most important goal was to preserve the inability of borrowers to discharge their student loans if they go bankrupt. So this organization preaches on the outside that it's their intention to help borrowers, but this controversy exposed that their real intentions seem to be more about making a profit than helping students. And beyond the system being run in a way that allows powerful institutions to make money while borrowers are suffering, the way that these institutions are lending is also often unethical. Sometimes lenders do something that's called predatory student lending. And this is when a lender exploits a borrower's dream of building a better life through higher education by convincing them to take out loans, even if they know that the borrower probably won't be able to repay them. So they're taking advantage of something called financial illiteracy, which is when a borrower really doesn't fully grasp what it means to be taking out tens of thousands of dollars in loans, and also isn't really able to foresee their future in a way that forces them to evaluate the likelihood of being able to repay them. And so I hope my presentation today has sort of helped you see how a system that was created with the intention of doing so much good has evolved into something that today can't do all of that good without also doing a lot of bad. So thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Helen. And on this one, I'm going to kind of extra encourage people to participate in the chat. Helen is my student, so I've had more than enough time to ask Helen questions, and I would love to focus more on questions from the audience. That said, let me go ahead and break the ice as I've done for the other speakers and ask a question to get us started. And that is, what do you see as the solution? If you were, say, Secretary of the Treasury, what sorts of what sorts of plans would you want to put on the table for potentially solving some of these issues?
So as far as solving the crisis and forgiving debt and modifying the way that the system operates, and just proposing a solution, that is sort of beyond the scope of my thesis. My thesis was more written to uncover some of these sort of hidden corruptions within the system and highlight the serious problems that are going on and that borrowers are facing. But it's an interesting question because in my research, I did stumble upon a lot of arguments regarding reform and loan forgiveness. And I think that sort of to offer my opinion on a solution, I think largely speaking, there needs to be a lot of reform done to the system. I think that the practice of predatory lending is something that really needs to be drilled down on and focused on so that it's not happening, because I think a main problem is borrowers are often being taken advantage of. And so challenging those systems that are lending to students needs to be a lot more widespread. And I think that regulations around that need to be a lot more prominent. But then as far as loan forgiveness, there are a lot of interesting arguments on both sides and whether or not they need to be forgiven, or what the United States should do to sort of help these borrowers struggling. And I think that I would suggest that it's something that needs to be explored. And I don't know if my opinion right now would be to forgive all of these loans, but I do think that there needs to be help given to these borrowers. And I think that especially in the wake of COVID and recently, it's just been such a hot topic. I think that a lot of work does need to be done to reform the system.
To bring it home, how do you think we're doing at UT? I mean, is this sort of, or more generally, is this problem of debt? Should we think of this as being an issue at kind of tier 1 public research universities? Or should we think of this as more of an issue with kind of for-profit or kind of private schools more generally?
I think on the surface, it is a larger problem with for-profit institutions and private institutions. UT actually, in my research, I was finding that it is regarded as one of the less expensive colleges, especially in Texas. And so while I do think that it's interesting to consider the tuition between in-state and out-of-state, I do think that there are a lot of people at UT having to take out loans. And I think that it is something that the UT system needs to sort of evaluate. But overall, I think that the problem is most prevalent within universities that are private and charging $80,000 a year for tuition, or for-profit institutions that have a lot of their own problems going on, just with predatory lending being most prevalent in those organizations. So as far as UT, I think that it's not as big of a problem as it is elsewhere, but I still do think that it is something that the university system should refocus and reevaluate the ways that they are lending and the problems that their students are having.
That's great. Okay, so a couple of things have come up on chat. One is just how do you think about student loans being different from other forms of debt? And I guess you can answer that both from your perspective in terms of the ethical considerations, but also in terms of, it seemed like you had some empirical evidence that people are for some reason uniquely stressed out about student loans. So I guess any thoughts you have on why that would be the case?
Yeah, so sort of at the core, a student loan is very similar to any sort of other loan, like a mortgage or a car loan, because it's just an agreement and an exchange of funds between two parties. But it's different because it's a lot riskier for the lender to issue a student loan. Loans such as a car loan, there's a tangible collateral. So if a borrower isn't able to make payments on their auto loan, then the lender can seize the car and recover some of their losses. But with a student loan, it's different because there is no collateral. It's not like the lender can seize the student if they're defaulting on their loans. And so that just makes it a lot riskier than a lot of other forms of debt. And in reading that study, I think that my opinion on why student debt is just more psychologically burdensome is because of the way that I see the cost and the benefit of this type of debt lining up. So, for example, with a mortgage, which is a large loan, and that is the largest form of household debt in the United States. But I think that with a mortgage, as long as you're living in the house, you're feeling the benefit of having that mortgage. You're every day seeing the dividends that that debt is paying because you get to live in your house. But then with student debt, I think that the overlap between the cost and benefit is really different. People are repaying their student loans decades after they've left college, and they're not consciously feeling the benefit that they got from taking out those loans 20 years after they left school and are still making those monthly payments. So in a good situation where someone took out a loan and they got a degree and got a well-paying job, even 20 years down the line, they might not really consciously be aware that, taking out that loan is what got me that job and what is sort of allowing me to live the life that I have now. But on the other side, in a worse situation, when someone doesn't even make it through college or makes it through and is not able to get a good job, they're even more so not seeing the benefit of that. And so, sort of in conclusion, wrapping that up, I think that it's a very different form of debt in the way that people are perceiving the cost of that debt, because they're experiencing it in the present, but the benefit they feel like is long forgone. And so it doesn't feel almost worth it to have that debt because they're not really seeing the benefit today.
Great. A question about debt forgiveness. And I guess you can answer this either in terms of your personal opinion or in terms of what sorts of proposals you've seen. How do you think about, or how do most of the proponents of forgiveness think about issues of equity? So you have some students who took out loans, others who didn't take out loans, potentially, worked during college to pay, or prioritized and sacrificed and paid off their loans so that earlier in life. How do you think about debt forgiveness kind of across those different types of people? I mean, would you, if you're going to forgive debt, would you make similar kind of payments to students or graduates who no longer have debt?
I think that it's a complicated question, because I think that the arguments are all very complicated in themselves. And I think that there is something to say about arguments to forgive all of student debt, because the situations of borrowers, and as I said, there are over 44 million borrowers that are still paying off debt. Their situations are really never the same across the board. So everyone has sort of approached the process of repaying their debt differently. And some people have certainly made many more sacrifices than others to ensure that they're able to pay off that debt. And so a type of forgiveness that would be sort of the same across the board, I think is a little harder to argue for, just given the choices that people have made and their circumstances. And so if I were to argue for some specific type of loan forgiveness program, I would say that it would need to be one that sort of did look more deeply at specific situations, because there are people who take out loans to go to graduate school to become a lawyer, and people who are taking out loans to go to graduate school to be an artist. And so the artist is in a more difficult situation post-grad, because it's a more difficult industry to be able to make a lot of money to repay that debt. And so I don't think that they should be punished in any way because they chose that career path and therefore given less forgiveness. But it's just things like that and choices that people make to sort of put off buying a home so that they can do really well with repaying their debt on the front end. In the end, I just think everyone's situation is so different. And so it would be extremely difficult to forgive student debt in the same way across the board. And so just sort of on that note, that's why I just think that the argument to forgive student debt is just a very complicated one. I think it's one that needs to be had, but I think there are just so many things to consider before making a decision on how to forgive student debt.
That's great. So we have one more question in the chat for Helen, and then I think what I'd like to do is after that to conclude the panel with a final question for everybody, and I'll give everybody a heads up now so that I don't have to surprise you. This sort of final question I'd like everybody to respond to is just thinking back on everything you've done over the past year. If there's kind of one kind of single thing that surprised you the most, or that you kind of learned the most, the sort of most unexpected thing that you've learned over the last year. So if you kind of want to ponder that a little bit, and we'll go through everybody. For Helen, kind of one last question from the audience, thinking about how colleges might be able to better align their incentives with the incentives of students. Are there are there things that you think colleges can do to better align their interests with students?
I think yes, and sort of in one example, a lot of colleges, when they are suggesting private lenders to their students, their financial aid offices often have partnerships with these private lenders. And so I think that that's in itself a little unethical. And so the financial aid offices beyond that could do a lot differently, I think, in helping these often teenagers making decisions on taking out this tremendous amount of debt. I think that being very transparent about the lenders that they're suggesting, and then also helping students navigate their debt while they're in college and out of college. I think that that's something that is really lacking at a lot of schools, because 18-year-olds taking out tens of thousands of dollars in debt is something that I think is more drastic than a lot of financial offices are treating it. And throughout college, these students need to be educated and prepared on what the future of repayment would look like. And I think also helping them after college, providing resources in one way or another to help them navigate that would be really beneficial. And I think that it depends on the college itself and sort of the industry within the higher education system that the college is in. But overall, I don't see a lot of alignment between the intentions of the student in taking out the debt and then the intentions of the college and having the student take out that debt. I just think that there's a lack of overlap there. And I think that the colleges could all be doing a lot more to help students and encourage them to be really smart when they're making these decisions that'll affect them for the rest of their lives.
That's great. Thank you very much, Helen. I enjoyed your presentation. It's been fun to talk to you about your thesis throughout the year. So why don't we go back? I'll start with Parker, and why don't you tell us, so what if there's sort of one thing that that surprised you the most, or kind of most unexpected thing that you learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think for my topic in particular, when I chose cryptocurrencies, kind of everyone looks at it as such like a technical aspect, and it's just kind of so closed off, and it just has all of these technical ramifications. But I think I was so surprised to learn about all of the potentials to impact individuals' lives, and whether that be through storing value when their fiat currencies are failing them, or when they're in a period of economic downturn, or just if they don't have access to bank accounts for whatever reason. I think it's been really interesting to explore the different ways that cryptocurrencies can help these different populations and just people worldwide to deal with different, very individual specific and population specific issues. So I thought that was really cool.
That's great. What about you, Avery?
Yeah, I think for me, it came in kind of the research methods, and I was really surprised by the breadth of material out there from central banks or institutions writing reports on some of these topics, and the lack of kind of attention it gets from media or other people participating. And I think that must just be because it's kind of an insular thing, but it was these 100, 200-page long reports that just don't ever get picked up or discussed outside of the smaller circles, and that was surprising to me.
It's great. It's nice to see you embracing the research. How about Ellison?
One of the most interesting things I came across once I decided to look more into the digital one is the different expectations that citizens have of their governments, and including like those around privacy. And something that very much surprised me, probably as a show of like kind of Western assumptions, was the amount of support or what would it be, satisfaction with the CCP in the past 2 years in China. Surveys are difficult to judge, but in terms of how credible they are, there's still fear around like answering honestly to even anonymous surveys. But overwhelmingly, there's been drastic increases, and that can't be said in the US, looking at like similar Pew research. So I think that was really interesting, of just expectations of government and then overall satisfaction in China with the current government.
It's very interesting. Thanks. Helen.
Okay, I think that the most shocking thing that I found in my research is, just broadly speaking, how corrupt that I think the student loan industry is. And in doing my research and reading more about the industry, I was discovering all of these things, and I was just shocked by every turn that I took in my research. There was something that was happening that was unethical, and the whole ethics of the system shocked me so much that I kind of jumped ship on my initial topic that I was going to write about. I was going to focus more on how we securitize student loans and how there's a market for student loan asset-backed securities. And I still think that that's interesting. I was just so appalled by finding all of these ethical concerns that I had to write about this. This was just something that I was so blown away by, some of these things that are happening. A lot more things than I was able to cover today. So yeah, it was interesting, and I'm glad I got to switch over and write about it.
All right. Well, thank you to all four of you. You're doing really interesting work, and I'm very, very happy and grateful that you were able to share it with all of us. I think it's students like you that make being on the faculty at UT just a really great privilege. So I commend you for kind of undertaking a serious research project over the last year. Thank you for sharing what you've learned with us. And with that, I guess we'll conclude this, and you all can go back to the grind of actually writing up the final product. So hopefully today was kind of a nice break to celebrate and to share. And so we also appreciate that, there's a fair amount of work that's gone into this, and quite a bit that probably all four of you have left. So good luck kind of wrapping everything up over the next few weeks. And thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thanks a lot.